Greetings. We are late July in the text, even though we're late July in real life. And Jesus is in Beth Horon. This is the subtext. Jesus in Beth Horon, hardships and privation of the disciples. It was toward 8 o'clock in the morning when Jesus arrived in Beth Horon. A couple of the disciples went to the dwelling of the elders and demanded the keys of the synagogue, as their master wanted to deliver an instruction. Others scattered through the streets and summoned the people to the school, while Jesus went with the rest to the synagogue, which was soon filled with auditors. He taught again in severe terms on the parable of the Lord of the vineyard, whose servants were murdered by the unfaithful vine dressers, whose son whom he had sent to them shared the same fate, who at last gave the vineyard into the hands of others. He spoke likewise of the persecution of the prophets and the imprisonment of John, saying that they would persecute him also and lay hands upon him, and he ended by predicting the judgment and woe that were to come upon Jerusalem. This discourse occasioned great excitement among the Jews. Some rejoiced, while others muttered angrily to one another, "Whence came this man so unexpectedly here? No one knew of his arrival." And some who had heard that there were women, followers of Jesus, at the inn in the valley, went out to question them on the designs of their master. Jesus cured several that were sick of the fever, and after some hours left the city. Veronica, Johanna Chusa, and Obed's widow had arrived at the inn and prepared a luncheon. Jesus and the disciples partook of it standing, after which they girded themselves and recommenced their journey. Jesus taught on the same day in Kibzaim on similar subjects as at Beth Horon, also in some small shepherd settlements. All the disciples were not present in Kibzaim, but they met again at a large house belonging to a shepherd. It was surrounded by outbuildings and stood on the confines of Samaria. Mary and Joseph had been hospitably received there on their journey to Bethlehem, after having vainly sought admittance elsewhere. Here Jesus and the disciples, about 15 in all, ate and slept. Lazarus and the women had returned to Bethany. So now it's Tuesday, July 5th, Ab the 6th, and we are in 30 AD. On the next day, Jesus and the disciples, sometimes together, sometimes in separate groups, passed rapidly through several large cities and small towns that lay in a district of some hours in extent. Gaba and Naioth, about 4 hours from Kibzaim, were among them. In none of these places did Jesus take the time to go to the synagogues to teach, but instructed the crowds that gathered to hear him on hills, in the open air, on the public places, and in the streets. Several of the disciples remained with Jesus, while the others scattered through the valleys and shepherd villages to call the dwellers to the places where Jesus was to pass. The whole day's work was performed with incredible hardship and fatigue, with constant going from place to place. Jesus cured many sick, some of whom were carried to him, but others cried out themselves for his aid. There were some lunatics among them. Many possessed ran clamoring after him, but he commanded them to be silent and to retire. What made the day's work still more wearisome was the bad dispositions of the people and the insults of the Pharisees. These places, being near Jerusalem, were full of people who had taken part against Jesus. It was then, as it is now, in little places they talk of everything without understanding anything. It was to such people that Jesus suddenly appeared with his band of disciples and his grave and denunciatory preaching. He repeated the instructions delivered at Beth Horon, spoke of the graces now offered for the last time, after which would come the day of justice, and again alluded to the ill usage of the prophets, the imprisonment of John, and the persecuted directed against himself. He brought forward, above all, the parable of the Lord of the vineyard, who had now sent his son. He said that the kingdom would soon come, and the king's son would enter into the possession of it. He often cried, "Woe!" to Jerusalem and to them that would not receive his kingdom, who would not do penance. These severe and menacing discourses were interrupted by many acts of charity and by the cure of the sick. In this way, Jesus journeyed from place to place. The disciples had much to endure, and it was often very hard for them. On reaching a town or village and annunciating the coming of Jesus, they often heard the scornful words, "What? Is he coming again? What does he want? Whence comes he? Has he not been forbidden to preach?" And they laughed at them, derided and insulted them. There were indeed a few that rejoiced to hear of Jesus' coming, but they were very few. No one ventured to attack Jesus himself, but wherever he taught, surrounded by his disciples, or proceeded along the street followed by them, the crowd shouted after them. They stopped the disciples and plied them with impertinent questions, pretending that they had misunderstood or only half comprehended his severe words, and demanding an explanation. Meanwhile, other cries resounded, cries of joy at some cure just wrought by Jesus. This scandalized the crowd, and they fell back and left him. So he continued till evening these rapid and fatiguing marches without rest or refreshment. I noticed how weak and human the disciples still were in the beginning. If during Jesus' instruction they were questioned as to his meaning, they shook their head as if they had not understood what he really meant. Nor were they satisfied with their condition. They thought to themselves, "Now we've left all things, and what have we for it but all this tumult and embarrassment? And what kind of a kingdom is he always speaking? Will he really gain it?" These were their thoughts. They kept them concealed in their own breast, though often manifesting discouragement in their countenance. John alone acted with the simplicity of a child. He was perfectly obedient and free from constraint. And yet the disciples had seen and were still witnessing so many miracles. It was indeed touching to think that Jesus knew all their thoughts and yet acted as if wholly ignorant of them. He changed nothing in his manner, but calmly, sweetly, and earnestly went on with his work. Jesus journeyed far into the night of that day, when on the side of the little river that forms the boundary of Samaria, he and his disciples stopped for the night among some shepherds, from whom they received little or nothing. The river water was not fit for drinking. It was a narrow stream here and there, not far from its source at the foot of the Gerizim, made a rapid turn toward the west. And so the reading is short today. I'll end it here because there's a new subtext, and that subtext is long. All right, so I'll give my notes. This is the first time we really hear the weariness of the disciples. She isolates St John the Evangelist, as the apostle that worked without complaint. And in the Gospel of St John, we always hear, like, when the Pharisees are taking up issues, what do? They complain, right? So we know that complaining is like a habitual rejection of the Lord. Like, he interrupts us, and then we revolt against the interruption. So the mystical city of God also singled out John for the love he had shown toward the Blessed Mother. It was because of this closeness to her that he probably harvested a more perfect harvested a more perfect relationship toward his Lord, and why he ended up at the foot of the cross with her. Now, I always say there's a theology of the mind and a theology in the heart. Rather, I've been saying it lately. And I believe St John the Evangelist mastered the theology in the heart. Now, I haven't used these words. It's like the parable of the two sons, right? The first one says yes, but he doesn't do it. The second one says no, but he does it. It means the heart emerged its truth eventually. It doesn't matter what come out of the mouth. Now, the mind is like an engineer. It's always planning and figuring things out, but the heart is like a motivator. The heart is, in and of itself, motivated by beauty and wonder. So we often hear the binary, the engineer versus the artist. And it very much pertains to the real world. St. John the Evangelist called himself the disciple whom Jesus loved. Love as in an act of the heart. The reason why is because he wanted to know the innermost workings of Christ, what he loved, what moved him. That's why we have in John 8, John 11 especially, when Mary Magdalene came to his feet and wept before him because her brother was lost, but her tears were the motivational factor in what caused Jesus to resurrect him, right? And this is what, if you would have been here, my brother would not have died. And then we get the line, and she wept before him, and then we get the line, Jesus was moved. And this is what John wanted to know. How was Jesus moved? He's moved by sorrows. He's moved by tears. He's moved by habits. He's not moved by complaints. So the reason why, and I'm not talking about, we look at complaints in a different way than the kind of complaints he wrote about. His complaints were more like pharisaical revolts. Now, the parable of the vineyard here is the one where the owner is trying to get his pay from his managers, but they hate that it's owned and they want the rights to it themselves. They want to inherit it. So they continue beating up his messengers till the owner sends his son. Jerusalem is the vineyard, and they are known as the city that punishes its prophets, that destroys its saints. And we think of how they treated Elijah and Jeremiah in particular, running them out of the city, throwing them in a muddy cistern, for example. And now Jesus, they seize him and kill him, hoping to take his inheritance because they have in them the theology of their mind. They're educated. They know the scriptures, but they don't love it. They have the wisdom to know how to create their own domain, but the lovelessness it took to reject the Lord. No theology in the heart. It's the true curse of the Pharisees, to know good and evil, but not to love the good. Adam ate the fruit of knowing good and evil before he could truly love the good, and because of that, he had evil inclinations. The theology of the heart, John's gospel, the children of God, the one who comes from above, the complaints of the Pharisees who do not understand what heaven's love looks like and rejects it because they would rather have control over their own dominion than the love of God come to chastise them and set them right. The fact that many of his disciples left when they heard from him that they had to eat his body and drink his blood. They just don't understand habit. So when God posed Jerusalem the question of obedience, Jerusalem, whom was his bride, and we get these colorful ideas from the prophets, the books of the prophets, where Jerusalem was the bride, and then she was, he took her and clothed her and whatnot, and then she ended up playing the whore and embarrassing God, and because of that, she forsook God, and then God forsook her. And the act of killing Christ was the act of Jerusalem forsaking God. So, love is a set of habits. It's not a declaration. We ought to know that by now. You're the parable. If you're the vineyard owners and you're taking care of the faith, we are in the vineyard, but are we truly thanking God? Are we giving God what's His? You can declare your love for God with your lying tongue, and your habits will tell Him the truth. Jesus seeks after your heart. He knows what is in there. The heart seeks after Him, the beauty, the love, the wonder. We all are drawn to Christ, but our minds wrench us away from Him because we become afraid. We make up these new ideas that interrupt our faith. We live a lazy lifestyle without habit, and we tear ourselves away from Him. And because the mind desires a troubleless existence, beauty acts as interruption. Yet as engineers control the world without love or beauty or wonder, they come upon newer and newer innovations, and we look at the world we're living in now, full of innovations and inventions, but their heart gets darker and darker in the eclipse of their own domain. Germany is the perfect example of this. It's a country full of engineers and innovators, but their arts, their beauty, those have nearly gone extinct there. So, is it in your habits to live a pure life, to give to those in need, to worship in a true way, to not love money at all, but to love, or mammon at all, but to love God? To say the rosary routinely with love? That's the question. Anyways, that's it. Ave Maria.